You know what Hollywood gets completely wrong about D-Day? Pretty much everything. Those dramatic movie scenes showing soldiers heroically charging off landing crafts in perfect formation? Pure fiction. The brutal reality was that when those young men hit the Normandy beaches on June 6, 1944, they entered a slaughterhouse where many never even made it to dry land. Within the first 10 bloody minutes at Omaha Beach, the ocean turned crimson as German machine guns mowed down entire squads before they could take a single step on French soil. But here's the part they never show you in the movies. D-Day wasn't just one day. After securing the beaches, the Battle of Normandy dragged on for another 85 grueling days. 85 days of pure hell as Allied troops fought their way through Normandy's deadly hedge maze. This brutal campaign would ultimately claim nearly 500,000 casualties on all sides and shatter the myth of German military invincibility forever. If you're enjoying these stories, smash that like button and subscribe. Seriously curious where you're all tuning in from? Drop a comment with your location and local time. It blows my mind imagining people across different time zones falling asleep to these war stories. Alright, let's transport ourselves back to 1944. Buckle up, it's going to be one hell of a ride. But first, get comfortable. I mean it, fluff those pillows, grab your blanket, because where we're headed, you'll want every bit of comfort you can get. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the belly of a landing craft bound for Omaha Beach. You're 19-year-old Tommy Miller from some nowhere town in Ohio, about to experience your first taste of combat. None of you greenhorns have ever seen real action before. You're crammed shoulder to shoulder with 30 other terrified boys in this metal death box that's bouncing across the English Channel like some demonic carnival ride. The air reeks of diesel fuel, wet wool uniforms, and vomit. So much vomit. The early June weather has churned the channel into a nightmare of 10-foot waves that keep slamming icy salt water over the sides. Nearly everyone's been seasick all night, including you. Your stomach's empty now, but you're still dry heaving. Your uniform's soaked through with a disgusting cocktail of sweat, seawater, and God knows what else. The heavy fabric clinging to your skin in all the wrong ways. Nothing like your cozy bed back home with its crisp sheets and that perfect weighted blanket feeling. Dawn's breaking on the horizon, but you can barely see it through the tracer rounds lighting up the sky. The entire craft shudders from the thunderous booms of naval guns firing from Allied ships behind you. Your ears are ringing. Everything smells like gunpowder, salt water, and raw fear. The young lieutenant who's supposed to be leading your platoon looks just as terrified as you feel, his face green from more than just seasickness. This chaotic nightmare is nothing like what they trained you for back in England. 5 minutes, shouts the coxswain operating the landing craft. Your stomach knots up tighter. For the 20th time, you check your gear. Your M1 Garand wrapped in cellophane against the salt water, bandoliers of ammo crisscrossing your chest, combat pack, entrenching tool, canteen, first aid kit, and enough other equipment to make you certain you'll sink like a stone the moment you hit the water. At least 60 pounds of gear dragging you down. Beside you, your buddy Mike from basic training is silently mouthing what might be a prayer. On your other side, some guy whose name you never learned stares at a photo of a young woman, his hands shaking so badly you're afraid he'll drop it into the sloshing water at your feet. Remember, the lieutenant shouts over the din, when that ramp drops, move fast. Don't stop on the beach. Head for the seawall. Find whatever cover you can. Easy for him to say. You try to swallow, but your mouth's bone dry despite the salt spray soaking your face. Through the metal walls, you hear the relentless pounding of artillery, the sharp cracks of small arms fire, and worst of all, the steady mechanical hammering of MG-42 machine guns. The Germans call it the bone saw for good reason. It spits out 200 rounds per minute, enough firepower to literally cut a man in half. The landing craft jolts violently as it hits a sandbar, nearly tipping sideways. Men stumble into each other. Someone's helmet clatters to the deck. The engine pitch changes as the coxswain struggles to push forward. 30 seconds. The fear becomes physical now. A cold, leaden weight in your chest making it hard to breathe. Your knees feel like they might buckle. You can't tell if it's the boats rocking or your own terror making you sway. The noise crescendos, shells exploding nearby send geysers of water skyward. Then you hear the unmistakable ping of bullets hitting the landing craft's metal ramp. Stand by. Everyone tenses. This is it. The craft grinds forward one last time before shuddering to a stop on the beach. A mechanical clank signals the ramp beginning to lower. Blinding light floods in after the dim interior. Then, hell explodes. The instant the ramp drops, machine gun fire rakes across the opening. The first 4 men are cut down before they can move, their bodies collapsing to block the exit. Blood pools around your boots. The lieutenant screams for everyone to move, to get off this floating coffin. You stumble forward, tripping over the fallen men as someone shoves you from behind. Suddenly you're in the water, not on the beach, but fully submerged in the freezing channel. It's deeper than you expected, well over your waist. Your equipment tries to drag you under as you desperately hold your waterproofed rifle above your head with one hand. All around you, men struggle through the water. Some disappear beneath the surface, pulled down by their packs. Others are hit by bullets that crack across the water like malevolent raindrops. The sea turns pink, then red. You push forward, each step a battle against the water, the shifting sand beneath you, and your own paralyzing fear. Your legs burn with the effort. The cold numbs your hands, but the beach ahead offers no real protection, just solid ground. The noise is overwhelming. Explosions, gunfire, the mechanical buzz of MG-42s, the screams of men. It's a symphony of death that makes coherent thought impossible. Some primal part of your brain takes over. Move forward. Find cover. Stay alive. You finally reach the beach, water streaming from your uniform. The sand is a nightmare obstacle course of wooden stakes, metal hedgehogs designed to gut landing craft, barbed wire coils, and bodies. So many bodies scattered like discarded toys. Ahead lies about 200 yards of open beach before the seawall and bluffs where the German guns are dug in. It might as well be 200 miles. The beach offers almost no cover, just a few wooden obstacles and the occasional shell crater. You sprint forward, zigzagging as trained. 10 yards. 20. Your lungs burn. Your soaked uniform weighs a ton. Bullets kick up sand around your feet. The man running beside you suddenly jerks and face plants into the sand. You don't stop. You reach a shell crater and dive in, landing hard enough to knock the wind from your lungs. 2 other men are already there. A medic frantically working on a soldier missing part of his arm, and a radio man with shattered equipment. We gotta keep moving. The radio man shouts over the din, "We're sitting ducks here." He's right, but the thought of leaving this shallow depression, the only thing between you and German bullets, is terrifying. You glance back toward the water. More landing craft approach. More men wade through the red surf. Many never make it. You check your rifle, peeling away the wet cellophane. It seems functional. You take a deep breath, nod to the radio man, and prepare to move. On 3, he shouts. 1, 2. Before 3, a mortar shell explodes nearby, showering your crater with sand and shrapnel. Your ears ring. The world moves in slow motion. You blink sand from your eyes to see the radio man pulling at your arm, shouting something you can't hear over the ringing. You stumble up and follow him toward another crater 30 yards ahead. Somehow you both make it. This one's larger, with several men, including a sergeant who's taken charge. Time loses all meaning on that beach. Minutes stretch into hours as you crawl from crater to crater, inching your way forward through the carnage. The tide keeps rising, shrinking the killing zone, pushing more men into the German guns' crosshairs. The dead and wounded litter the waterline, some being dragged back into the surf by the retreating waves. Eventually, you reach the base of the seawall, a low concrete barrier that finally offers real protection from the murderous fire. Hundreds of men huddle here, pinned down by the guns above. Officers try to organize an assault on the bluffs, but communication is nearly impossible in this chaos. You press your back against the cold concrete, grateful for this brief respite. Your uniform is caked with wet sand, your hands raw and bleeding. Your throat burns with thirst, but when you reach for your canteen, You find it punctured by shrapnel, empty. A colonel moves along the seawall, rallying the survivors. "We didn't come this far to die on this goddamn beach," he shouts. "We take those bluffs, or we drown when the tide comes in." He organizes teams to use Bangalore torpedoes, long tubes packed with explosives, to blow gaps in the barbed wire above the seawall. You're assigned to one of these teams, given the suicidal job of helping place the explosives. Your squad waits for covering fire, then scrambles up the slope beyond the seawall. You keep your head down as bullets whip overhead. The Bangalore is heavy, awkward. You help shove it through the barbed wire while another soldier primes the fuse. "Fire in the hole," someone yells, and you all dive for cover. The explosion rips a hole in the wire, sending twisted metal flying. Before the dust settles, men are already charging through the gap. You follow, rifle ready. The ground is steep, slippery with sand and blood. Your lungs burn as you climb. Somehow, you reach the top of the bluff. The German trenches are just ahead. You can see their helmets, the barrels of their weapons. They're firing desperately now, knowing what's coming. The Americans around you let out a ragged cheer as they close in. What follows isn't heroic. It's brutal, close-quarters slaughter. Rifle fire, grenades, bayonets, even fists. Men scream in English and German. The trenches change hands one bloody yard at a time. You fire your Garand until it's empty, then reload with shaking hands. You see things you'll never forget. Men torn apart by grenades. Others crying for their mothers as they bleed out. You move forward in a daze, acting on instinct and training. By late afternoon, your unit has secured a small section of the bluffs overlooking Omaha Beach. The Germans have fallen back to secondary positions. Against all odds, you survived the landing, something that seemed impossible just hours ago. You find yourself in a captured German bunker as the sun sets. The concrete walls are pockmarked with bullet holes. The floor is littered with empty shell casings. It smells like gunpowder, sweat, and death, but it's shelter. Someone passes around canteens and K-rations. You eat mechanically, barely tasting the food. Your hands won't stop trembling. You've been awake for nearly 40 hours, but sleep feels impossible. Every time you close your eyes, you see the beach, the men who didn't make it. A lieutenant comes through, counting survivors. Your company landed with 197 men that morning. Only 87 are left. You learn your buddy Mike never made it off the landing craft. The nameless lieutenant who led you onto the beach died in the water. These facts register distantly, like they're happening to someone else. "Get some rest if you can," the lieutenant says. "We move inland at first light." You find a corner of the bunker, prop your rifle against the wall, and sink to the cold floor. Your muscles ache. Your uniform is still damp, chafing your skin. Outside, the sounds of battle continue. Sporadic gunfire, distant explosions, the rumble of vehicles moving up from the beach. As darkness falls over Normandy, you realize D-Day is over. You survived, but this is just the beginning. The Germans still hold most of France. The real battle, the one that will last all summer, is only starting. You close your eyes, knowing tomorrow will bring more fighting, more death. But for now, in this concrete bunker reeking of gunpowder and fear, you're still alive. And somewhere in Ohio, your mother still thinks you're safe at a training camp in England. She has no idea her son just lived through the largest amphibious invasion in history. No idea you've already seen more death than most people will in a lifetime. No idea the beach you landed on today will soon have a new name in the history books. Bloody Omaha. You drift into an uneasy sleep, your rifle clutched to your chest like a child's teddy bear. As the sounds of war continue through the Norman night, the German army is regrouping, bringing reinforcements. The war is far from over. The beachhead is secure, but inland waits the hedgerows, thousands of small fields enclosed by ancient earthen berms topped with tangled hedges. A perfect defensive maze that will soon become a killing ground for both sides. A place where tanks struggle to maneuver and soldiers die in small, anonymous battles for patches of French soil. Tomorrow, the real Battle of Normandy begins. But for now, you sleep, the shallow, alert sleep of a soldier in a war zone, ready to wake at the slightest sound. ready to fight again when dawn breaks over the blood-soaked shores of France. As night settles over Normandy, the naval guns continue their bombardment inland. Their distant thunder becomes a violent lullaby. Medics work by flashlight in makeshift aid stations. Landing craft keep bringing men and supplies to the secured beaches. The invasion machine grinds forward, unstoppable now. And in a concrete bunker that smells of death, a 19-year-old boy from Ohio dreams of home, his innocence left somewhere on the blood-red sands of Omaha Beach. While Tommy and thousands of others were preparing to storm the Normandy beaches, another battle was already unfolding in the darkness. Hours before the first landing craft touched shore, the night sky over France had filled with the distant drone of aircraft engines. Inside those planes, men braced themselves for what many considered a suicide mission, jumping into enemy territory under cover of darkness. James Cooper sat rigid in the belly of a C-47 transport plane, the metal bench cold beneath him despite the June heat. At 22, he was a sergeant with the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. He'd been awake for nearly 24 hours, wired on a toxic cocktail of fear, adrenaline, and the terrible coffee they'd served before boarding. The plane's interior was dim, lit only by a single red bulb that cast everyone in a hellish glow. 20 men sat in 2 rows, backs against the fuselage, knees nearly touching. Each paratrooper was loaded down with equipment: main parachute on the back, reserve on the chest, an M1 rifle broken down and strapped to his leg, plus ammunition, grenades, rations, medical supplies, and mission-specific gear. All told, they were jumping with nearly 100 pounds strapped to their bodies. Cooper glanced at his watch. Just past midnight on June 6th. In less than an hour, they'd be dropping into occupied France. Their mission: secure the causeways leading from Utah Beach to let the seaborne forces move inland at dawn. The man beside him, Private Wilkins from Tennessee, was mumbling what sounded like a prayer. Across the narrow aisle, Lieutenant Winters reviewed a map by the dim red light. Most of the others sat in silence, lost in their own thoughts. Some slept, a skill Cooper had always envied but never mastered. The plane hit turbulence, dropping suddenly before catching itself. Several men cursed. Someone retched into a canvas bag. The smell of vomit mixed with sweat, cigarettes, and the coconut-scented insect repellent they'd all slathered on. Beneath it all was the sharp tang of gun oil. They'd cleaned their weapons obsessively before this jump. Cooper felt the weight of the cricket clicker in his pocket, a child's toy that made a metallic click-clack when pressed. Tonight, it would be their lifeline. One click would be answered with 2, friend distinguishing himself from foe in the darkness. Such a small thing to stake your survival on. Through the small circular window, Cooper could see other C-47s in formation, their outlines barely visible against the night sky. Hundreds of aircraft, all headed for the Cotentin Peninsula. Below them stretched the English Channel, black and endless. 20 minutes to drop zone, the jumpmaster shouted over the engine noise. Cooper's mouth went dry. This was it. After 2 years of training, endless practice jumps, and combat drills, they were going to war. The invasion of Europe was beginning, and they were the tip of the spear. Stand up. The jumpmaster's command cut through the engine's drone. 20 men rose as one, joints cracking, equipment jangling. Hook up. Each man connected his static line to the cable running along the ceiling. Check equipment. Cooper ran his hands over his gear, then checked the man in front of him. A ritual so ingrained he could do it in his sleep. Sound off for equipment check. The count began from the rear, each man shouting his number when verified. As they neared the French coast, the plane began bucking violently. Flak burst around them, black puffs against the night sky. The C-47 had no armor, no defensive weapons. They were sitting ducks. "We're taking fire," someone shouted unnecessarily. The plane lurched as the pilot took evasive action. Men stumbled, grabbing each other for support. Then the green light near the door illuminated. The jumpmaster slid open the door, and cold air rushed in, carrying the smell of cordite and distant explosions. Go, go, go. One by one, The paratroopers shuffled toward the door and vanished into the darkness. Cooper moved forward mechanically. When his turn came, he couldn't hesitate. He launched himself into the void. The slipstream caught him immediately, the prop blast slamming into him like a physical blow. For one terrifying second, he tumbled uncontrolled through darkness. Then came the gut-wrenching jerk as his parachute deployed, the straps cutting into his shoulders. The noise of the aircraft faded, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by distant flak and the rustling of his canopy. Cooper looked around, trying to orient himself. Below, France was a patchwork of shadows. He could make out fields, hedgerows, maybe a road, all intermittently lit by flares and explosions. White parachutes drifted everywhere like ghostly jellyfish. But something was wrong. They were scattered across miles, not dropping in formation on their designated zones. The planes had broken formation under anti-aircraft fire, dispersing the entire airborne division across the Norman countryside. The ground rushed up faster than expected. Cooper hit hard, rolling awkwardly as his equipment dug into his ribs. For a moment, he lay there, breath knocked from his lungs. Then training took over. He needed to get out of his harness, retrieve his weapon, and find his unit. Every second in the open increased the risk of being spotted. His fingers worked the harness clasps. The parachute had to be buried. White silk would be a beacon at daylight. Once free, he assembled his M1 with practiced movements. The familiar weight was comforting. He pulled out his cricket clicker and pressed it once. Click-clack. No response. He tried again, moving cautiously through the field. Click-clack. This time, a faint reply came from his left. Click-clack, click-clack. Cooper moved toward the sound. The field was bordered by one of Normandy's infamous hedgerows, earthen banks topped with tangled vegetation that had stood for centuries. These ancient barriers would soon become their worst nightmare. Flash, Cooper whispered as he approached the shadowy figure by the hedgerow. Thunder, came the reply, their verbal recognition signal. It was Wilkins, the man who'd sat next to him on the plane. The private had a tear in his jumpsuit, but otherwise looked unharmed. Any sign of the others? Cooper asked. Wilkins shook his head. Saw shoots all over the place. We're miles off course. This was the nightmare scenario. Entire companies scattered across the countryside. Small groups trying to complete missions designed for hundreds. We need to figure out where we are, Cooper said, pulling out his compass and silk map. They had no idea where they'd landed. The training mock-ups hadn't prepared them for being lost in this maze. I think that's a road over there, Wilkins said, pointing. Cooper nodded. Let's check it. Stay low and quiet. They moved through the darkness, boots sinking into muddy ground. As they approached the road, Cooper suddenly raised his hand. Halt. Voices. Speaking German. He dropped to his stomach, Wilkins following suit. Through gaps in the hedge, they saw 6 German soldiers with MP-40 submachine guns patrolling the road. They lay motionless as the patrol passed. The Germans seemed relaxed, unaware that thousands of Allied paratroopers had just dropped around them. That wouldn't last. When the patrol was gone, they crossed the road and continued searching for friendly forces. The night was filled with distant combat, sporadic gunfire, explosions, the drone of aircraft overhead. Hours passed as they navigated from hedgerow to hedgerow, using their crickets sparingly. They encountered no one, neither friend nor foe. At dawn, they found a group of about 15 paratroopers from mixed units, 101st, 82nd, even a lost British paratrooper. A lieutenant from the 506th was organizing them. We're about 3 miles from Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, the lieutenant said. The 505th took the town. We'll link up with them, then move toward our objectives. At least they had a plan. As the group prepared to move out, Cooper checked his gear, canteen full, ammo dry. The invasion was hours old, and he hadn't fired a shot yet. That would change soon enough. The American advance reached a crossroads about 250 meters from the church and paused, setting up machine guns. A Sherman tank rumbled into position behind a collapsed building, its main gun scanning for targets. Muller assessed the threat. The tank was the primary danger. Their lone Panzerfaust would have to be used at close range to be effective. Schmidt, Take 2 men to that building across the street, Muller ordered. If that tank advances, hit it from the side with the Panzerfaust. Schmidt nodded and selected 2 soldiers, including Kramer. They slipped out the church's back and worked through rubble to a flanking position. For hours, a tense stalemate held. The Americans didn't advance further, apparently waiting for reinforcements. Muller's men remained hidden, conserving strength and ammunition. In afternoon, the artillery pattern changed. Shells began falling more randomly across town. Then Muller noticed German vehicles moving on the western outskirts. A runner arrived with new orders. General withdrawal from St. Lo. Fall back to positions 5 kilometers south. Move in small groups after dark. Again, the familiar pattern: resist, delay, withdraw. The defense of St. Lo, like so many others, would end in German retreat. Muller signaled to Schmidt across the street. They would pull out after dark. Then he gathered the men in the church to explain the plan. We move in 2 groups. Schmidt takes the first west through the ruins. I'll lead the second along the river route. Rally point is the crossroads at La Chapelle. The men accepted the news with the resignation of troops accustomed to retreat. No surprise, no protest, just weary acknowledgement that they would abandon another position, sacrifice another piece of France in the slow collapse of the Atlantic Wall. At dusk, the first group slipped away. An hour later, Muller's group followed, leaving behind booby traps to slow pursuit. The night was clear with a half-moon providing enough light to navigate the devastated streets. They moved silently, alert for American patrols. The retreat from St. Lo marked another milestone in the Battle of Normandy. The city had been a key road junction, a linchpin in the German defensive line. Its loss opened the way for American forces to push south toward Brittany and east toward the Seine. For Muller and his dwindling band of survivors, it was simply another step in their long withdrawal. They had been retreating since D-Day, trading space for time, trying to make the Allies pay for every advance. But the Allies kept coming, kept paying the price in blood. As they marched through the darkness, Muller reflected on the campaign. The vaunted Atlantic Wall had failed. The hedgerow country that should have been perfect defensive terrain had been overcome by American ingenuity and overwhelming firepower. The towns turned into fortresses had been reduced to rubble and captured one by one. What hope remained? The war was being lost on all fronts. Russians advancing in the east, Americans and British breaking out of Normandy in the west, Italy already fallen. The skies over Germany were filled with Allied bombers day and night. Yet they fought on. Some from fanatical belief in the Nazi cause. Some from a soldier's duty to obey orders. Many simply to survive, to protect their comrades, to make it through one more day in a war they no longer believed could be won. Muller fell into the last category. He had seen too much, lost too many friends, retreated from too many positions to believe in final victory. He fought now for his men, to keep as many alive as possible in a campaign designed to grind the Wehrmacht to dust against the anvil of Normandy. They reached the rally point near dawn, joining other German units retreating from St. Lo. Staff officers directed them to new defensive positions. The cycle would begin again: dig in, resist, delay, withdraw. As Muller supervised his men preparing new foxholes, he gazed back north towards St. Lo, now in American hands. How much longer could this continue? Where were the strategic reserves the propaganda broadcasts constantly mentioned but never appeared at the front? The answers would come soon enough. Unknown to Muller and his exhausted infantrymen, the Allied forces were preparing Operation Cobra, a massive breakout attempt using carpet bombing to shatter German defenses. When it came, it would mark the beginning of the end for German forces in Normandy. But for now, there was only the immediate reality. The foxhole that needed digging deeper, the machine gun that needed cleaning, the meager rations to be distributed. The grinding, exhausting business of fighting a defensive campaign against an enemy with superior numbers, equipment, and air power. This was the German experience in Normandy, a long defeat, a fighting withdrawal, a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. For men like Karl Muller who had survived thus far, the only victory left was survival itself. The improvised unit moved out just as dawn's first true light broke over the hedgerows. They stayed off roads, slipping through fields and woods where possible. Occasionally, they heard combat in the distance. The distinctive crack of American M1s, the deeper report of German Mausers, the staccato bursts of machine guns. They were passing through an apple orchard when death found them. A German MG-42 opened fire from a farmhouse 200 yards away. Bullets shredded leaves and branches, sending wooden shrapnel flying. "Cover!" the lieutenant shouted needlessly. Everyone was already diving for the dirt. Cooper found himself behind the gnarled trunk of an apple tree, pitiful cover against machine gun fire. Wilkins was several trees over, returning fire with his M1. The British paratrooper, Mills, was working around the flank with another soldier, trying to get an angle on the farmhouse. The lieutenant organized a base of fire, half the men shooting to keep the Germans pinned while the others maneuvered closer. Cooper stayed with the firing group, bracing his rifle against the tree trunk as he aimed at the farmhouse windows. The firefight lasted maybe 10 minutes, but felt much longer. Mills and 3 Americans got close enough to toss grenades through the windows. The explosions brought sudden silence. Then the surrender of 3 surviving Germans, scared, confused boys who looked barely older than Cooper's kid brother back in Pennsylvania. They had no capacity to take prisoners. After brief interrogation by a German-speaking paratrooper, they learned a full company of Wehrmacht infantry was stationed in a nearby village. The lieutenant made the hard decision to leave the Germans tied up in the farmhouse, taking only their weapons. "We'll send someone back for them," he told Cooper when questioned. "Our mission comes first." Cooper understood the cold logic, even if it meant leaving enemies who might escape and rejoin the fight. War forced impossible choices hourly. They continued towards Sainte Marie du Mont, moving more cautiously now. The Norman countryside was waking, not just soldiers, but French civilians peering from farmhouses, some offering water, others slamming shutters fearfully. Around mid-morning, they encountered a larger group of American paratroopers who'd established a defensive position at a crossroads. Their commander, a captain from the 506th, had gathered nearly 60 men from various units. "We're heading for the causeway at Popeville," he told them. "That's one of our primary objectives, securing the exits from Utah Beach so the seaborne forces can move inland." Cooper felt his first real surge of purpose since landing. The scattered drops had created chaos, but the paratroopers' adaptability was imposing order. Small groups were finding each other, coalescing into fighting units, moving toward objectives despite the confusion. As they prepared to move out, the distant thunder of naval gunfire reached them, the massive bombardment preceding the beach landings. The invasion was in full swing now, thousands fighting ashore while paratroopers secured inland objectives. They advanced through a series of small fields bordered by the infamous hedgerows. The captain split them into 2 groups, one providing covering fire while the other advanced, then switching roles in leapfrog fashion. Cooper found himself beside Mills as they waited to advance. The Brits' red beret marked him as 6th Airborne Division, dropped miles east of his intended zone. "How'd you end up with us Yanks?" Cooper asked. "Bloody pilot got lost," Mills replied, checking his Sten gun's magazine. "Dropped us miles off course. Lost my whole stick in the drop. Figure I'll help you lot until I find my unit." The signal came, a raised hand from their sergeant. They moved forward at a crouch through a hedgerow gap located by scouts. The next field held only cows regarding the armed men with bovine indifference. For Cooper, the next hours blurred together, moving field to field, occasional firefights with German patrols, brief rests to check maps. By early afternoon, they'd linked with more paratroopers and approached the Popeville Causeway, encountering their first serious resistance, a German strongpoint guarding the beach exit road. About 30 Wehrmacht soldiers with machine guns and a repurposed 20mm anti-aircraft gun had dug in. The battle was brief but intense. The Americans used superior numbers to overwhelm the position. Cooper advanced through smoke and dust, firing his M1 at shapes barely recognizable as human. The cracks of rifles, burps of submachine guns, and screams of wounded created a hellish symphony. When it ended, the causeway was in American hands. They'd completed at least one D-Day objective, though hours late. As they set up defensive positions, an officer arrived with beach news. Utah secure. 4th Division moving inland. Omaha had rough going, but established a beachhead. We're holding a corridor about 3 miles deep in places. The news brought exhausted cheers. The invasion was succeeding. Despite chaotic drops, the paratroopers had done their job, disrupting German communications, capturing key positions, creating confusion that prevented a coordinated counterattack. At dusk, Cooper found a quiet moment by a stone wall. His uniform was filthy with mud, grass, and blood, thankfully not his own. He was bone-tired after nearly 40 awake hours. His hands shook slightly as he opened a K-ration, forcing himself to eat the unappetizing contents. The peaceful Norman countryside seemed at odds with the violence that had erupted across it. Cows still grazed in fields where men had died hours before. Apple trees heavy with unripe fruit stood witness to firefights. Somewhere, French families huddled in cellars waiting for the storm to pass. Tomorrow would bring more fighting as they pushed to link up with beach forces. But for now, Cooper watched the sunset paint the hedgerows gold and allowed himself to believe he might survive this war. The night brought sporadic gunfire as units continued finding each other in the darkness. The vast airborne drop zone was slowly being consolidated, order emerging from chaos. In the distance, naval guns still rumbled. Somewhere, thousands of soldiers were experiencing their first night on French soil, just as Cooper was. As stars appeared, Cooper thought of the journey that brought him here. From a Pennsylvania steel town to a Norman hedgerow, from training jumps at Fort Benning to this night in occupied France. The invasion was hours old, and he hadn't even reached his assigned objective yet. He settled in for a few hours of rifle across the lap sleep, ready to wake at the slightest sound. Around him, other paratroopers did the same, catching sleep in bursts. Their war had just begun. 2 weeks after D-Day, the Allied advance had slowed to a crawl. The beaches were secure. The paratroopers had linked up with the seaborne forces, and supplies flowed steadily across the English Channel. But inland, the American, British, and Canadian soldiers faced a new kind of hell, one that no training had prepared them for. The Normandy bogged. Tommy Miller, the young soldier from Ohio who had survived the bloody landing at Omaha Beach, now found himself trapped in a maze of ancient hedgerows. His company had advanced just 8 miles in 14 days, a pace that could be matched by a determined snail. Every foot of ground had been paid for in blood. "Keep your damn head down," Staff Sergeant Frank Gaines hissed, yanking Tommy back by his webbing. A rifle shot cracked a split second later, the bullet whizzing through the space where Tommy's head had been. Fragments of bark exploded from a nearby apple tree. "Sorry, Sarge," Tommy mumbled, pressing himself lower into the wet earth. The rain that had been falling intermittently for days had turned everything to mud. His uniform hadn't been properly dry in a week. His boots squelched with every step. The damp had worked its way into everything. Rifles that needed constant cleaning to prevent rust, ammunition that had to be kept meticulously dry, rations that turned to soggy mush in their pockets. "They got a sniper in that farmhouse," Gaines said, peering through field glasses at the stone structure about 300 yards ahead. "Been picking at us all morning." Tommy's platoon was pinned down along one of the ubiquitous hedgerows that crisscrossed the Norman countryside. These weren't the neatly trimmed hedges of English gardens. They were earthen berms, sometimes 10 feet high, topped with tangled trees and brush that had grown together over centuries. The roots ran deep, creating walls that no tank could breach. Each field was its own fortress, and the Germans had turned them into killing grounds. "What are we supposed to do?" asked Private Rodriguez, a replacement who had joined their unit just a week ago. "We can't stay here all day." "Wait for the mortars," Gaines replied. "Lieutenant called in a fire mission. Should be dropping any minute now." As if on cue, the distant crump of American mortars firing reached them, followed seconds later by explosions around the farmhouse. The Germans had learned to take cover quickly, though Tommy doubted the barrage would do much more than keep their heads down for a few minutes. First squad, get ready to move. Lieutenant Hayes called from further down the hedgerow. Second squad provides covering fire. Tommy was in first squad. He checked his M1 Garand for what felt like the 100th time that day, making sure the action was clear of mud. The lieutenant's whistle blew, and second squad opened up, pouring fire toward the German positions. Tommy and the others rose into a crouch and began moving. They didn't head straight for the farmhouse. That would have been suicide. Instead, they moved laterally along the hedgerow, looking for the gap they'd been told existed somewhere to the left. Each hedgerow-bordered field connected to others through narrow openings, creating a labyrinth that favored defenders. The gap, when they found it, was barely wide enough for one man at a time. The squad bunched up as they filtered through, each soldier hunched over to present a smaller target. Tommy was fourth in line. As he slipped through the gap, the world narrowed to a tunnel of green. Dripping leaves above, mud below, the smell of wet vegetation all around. Then he was through, into the next field, moving along the inside of another hedgerow that ran perpendicular to the first. The plan was simple in theory. Flank the German position by moving through two more fields, then hit the farmhouse from the side, where they'd have less cover. But simple plans rarely survive contact with the enemy. They were halfway across the second field when machine gun fire erupted from the hedgerow ahead. The distinctive ripping canvas sound of the German MG-42 sent everyone diving for cover. But there was no cover in the middle of a muddy field. "Move left," the sergeant shouted. "Get to the hedgerow." Tommy scrambled on hands and knees. Then in a desperate crouched run toward the relative safety of the hedgerow they'd just left. Bullets kicked up mud around him. The man to his right, Henley, a replacement who'd arrived just 3 days ago, jerked suddenly and fell face first into the mud. He didn't get up. Somehow Tommy reached the hedgerow. He pressed his back against the slick earth of the berm, chest heaving, ears ringing from the machine gun fire. For others made it with him. 3 didn't. "They knew we were coming," Rodriguez gasped, his face spattered with mud and what might have been blood. "They're on every damn hedgerow." "Lieutenant's hit," another soldier reported. "Saw him go down near the gap." Tommy closed his eyes for a moment. Lieutenant Hayes had been one of the few original officers left from D-Day. A good man who'd somehow kept most of them alive through the first 2 weeks of Hedgerow Hell. "What now, Sarge?" Tommy asked, turning to Gaines. But Sergeant Gaines wasn't there. In the chaos, they'd been separated. Tommy realized with a sinking feeling that he was now the highest-ranking soldier in their little group. A corporal with exactly 17 days of combat experience. "We need to get back to the company," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Find the gap again and head back the way we came." "What about Henley and the others?" Rodriguez asked. "We'll come back for them," Tommy said, knowing it might not be true. In the hedgerows, the wounded often lay where they fell until nightfall, when stretcher bearers might risk retrieving them. Many bled out before help arrived. They worked their way back along the hedgerow, staying low, moving from tree to tree where the vegetation was thinner. The German machine gun fired sporadically, more to keep them pinned than with any real targets. The gap, when they found it again, was now covered by German fire. They could hear American weapons on the other side. The rest of the company still fighting, but crossing that gap would be suicide. "We need to find another way around," Tommy decided. "There's usually more than one gap in these hedgerows." And so began an hours-long ordeal of navigating the bocage, moving from field to field, trying to circle back to their unit while avoiding German patrols and fixed positions. The overcast sky made it difficult to maintain direction. The fields all looked the same, small rectangles or irregular shapes of muddy farmland bordered by the omnipresent hedgerows. By mid-afternoon, they were thoroughly lost. The sounds of battle had receded, which could mean either that the fighting had moved on or that they had wandered away from it. Their little group had grown to 7 as they'd encountered other lost American soldiers, including a radio man named Parker whose equipment had been damaged by a bullet. "Can't you fix it?" Tommy had asked when they found him trying to repair his SCR-300 radio in the shelter of a bombed-out cowshed. "Not without parts," Parker replied. "Took a round right through the transmitter." They took shelter in that same cowshed as the rain intensified. The structure was only partially standing, but even a half roof was better than nothing. Tommy organized a watch rotation, placing men at each corner of the building. If the Germans found them here, at least they wouldn't be surprised. What happens if we can't find our unit? Rodriguez asked as they shared K rations, processed cheese, and stale crackers that tasted like wet cardboard. We keep moving east, Tommy said with more confidence than he felt. That's the direction of the advance. We'll run into Americans eventually. If the Germans don't find us first, he thought but didn't say. As evening approached, the rain finally stopped. Tommy climbed carefully to the remaining section of loft to get a better view of the surrounding area. From this slight elevation, he could see over some of the hedgerows. What he saw didn't lift his spirits. The Norman countryside stretched in all directions, a patchwork quilt of small fields divided by the dark lines of hedgerows. Here and there, pillars of smoke rose from burning buildings or vehicles. In the far distance, he could see flashes of artillery, but nothing that clearly indicated where American lines might be. He was about to climb down when movement caught his eye. A column of American vehicles, including several tanks, was moving along a road about half a mile east. His heart leapt. "Found our guys," he reported when he returned to the others. "Looks like elements of the 2nd Armored moving on a road east of here." "Thank Christ," someone muttered. "I've had enough of these damn hedgerows to last a lifetime." They set out immediately, hoping to reach the American column before dark. But navigating the bocage remained as challenging as ever. What looked like a half-mile journey as the crow flies became a winding 2-mile trek through the maze of hedgerow-bordered fields. The sun was setting by the time they finally reached the road. The tank column was long gone, but they found an American aid station set up in a sturdy stone farmhouse. Medics were treating wounded men inside, while military police directed traffic at a nearby crossroads. 4th Infantry Division, one of the MPs asked when Tommy's group approached. "First," Tommy replied. "Got separated during an attack this morning." "Where are we exactly?" The MP showed them on a map. They had wandered nearly 2 miles from their unit's position. The good news was that the division was scheduled to be pulled off the line tomorrow for rest and reorganization. If they stayed at the aid station overnight, they could catch a ride back to their unit in the morning. That night, Tommy slept on the floor of the farmhouse kitchen, his first time indoors in 2 weeks. The floor was hard, but it was dry, and for a few hours, he was relatively safe from German shells and bullets. In the Norman darkness, artillery flashed on the horizon, but it was distant now, almost like a thunderstorm seen from far away. In the morning, a deuce-and-a-half truck took them back to the 1st Division's position. Tommy found what remained of his company resting in an apple orchard. Of the 197 men who had landed on Omaha Beach, only 51 remained. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing. Sergeant Gaines was there, his left arm in a sling from a graze wound. He didn't smile when he saw Tommy and the others, but the relief in his eyes was evident. "Thought you boys were goners," he said. "Good to have you back." "What's the word, Sarge?" Tommy asked. MP said we're being pulled off the line. Gaines nodded. 24 hours of rest, then we're back at it. Regiment's bringing up some new toys they say will help with these damned hedgerows. The new toys arrived the next day, bulldozer blades welded to the front of Sherman tanks. The idea was simple. Instead of trying to go through the gaps in the hedgerows where German gunners were always waiting, the modified tanks would plow right through the hedgerows themselves, creating new openings. "They're calling them Rhino tanks," explained the engineering officer who'd come to demonstrate. "The blades came from beach obstacles the Germans left on Omaha and Utah. Turns out they're perfect for cutting through these hedgerows." Tommy watched as one of the modified Shermans approached a hedgerow at a deliberate pace. The welded tusks at the front of the tank dug into the earthen berm, and the tank pushed forward. For a moment, it seemed like the ancient barrier would resist even this assault. The tank's treads spun in the mud, engine roaring. Then suddenly the hedgerow gave way, and the Sherman pushed through, creating a gap wide enough for vehicles and infantry to follow. A cheer went up from the watching soldiers. After weeks of being channeled through the narrow, predictable gaps in the hedgerows, They finally had a way to make their own paths. "That'll change things," Sergeant Gaines said, a rare smile crossing his weathered face. "Jerry won't know where to set his ambushes now." The brief respite ended all too soon. By the following morning, Tommy's company was back on the line, preparing for yet another attack. The objective was a village called St. Lo, a key road junction that the Germans were defending fanatically. Taking it would mean pushing through miles more of hedgerow country. As they geared up, Tommy noticed how much his platoon had changed in just 2 weeks of combat. More than half the faces were new replacements who looked impossibly young and scared. The veterans, those who had survived Omaha Beach and the first days in the hedgerows, had a different look. Older somehow, though most were still in their early 20s. Their movements were efficient, economical. They didn't waste energy on unnecessary talk or motion. Tommy realized he was now one of those veterans. Somewhere in the mud and blood of Normandy, he'd left behind the scared kid from Ohio and become something else. A soldier who understood that survival depended on a mixture of skill, caution, and blind luck. He checked his equipment methodically, rifle clean and oiled, ammunition dry, grenades secure, first aid packet accessible, helmet strapped tight. They moved out just after dawn, advancing behind 2 of the new Rhino tanks. The armored vehicles crashed through hedgerows like battering rams, creating paths where none had existed before. The infantry followed close behind, rushing through the new gaps before German gunners could adjust their fields of fire. For the first time since landing in France, Tommy felt like they had the upper hand. They were no longer forced to use the routes the Germans expected, no longer channeled into prepared killing zones. They were making progress, not fast, but steady. Field by field, hedgerow by hedgerow, they pushed the Germans back. But the enemy adapted quickly. Unable to predict where the Americans would breach the hedgerows, they fell back on another tactic: mines. By the 3rd day of the new offensive, the Germans had seeded the fields with thousands of anti-personnel and anti-tank mines. The advance slowed again as engineers had to clear paths before the tanks could move forward. The weather turned against them, too. More rain fell, turning the Norman soil to thick, clinging mud that bogged down vehicles and exhausted infantry. Men slipped and fell as they tried to climb the muddy slopes of hedgerows. Tanks lost traction and became stranded. Through it all, the artillery rarely stopped. Both sides pounded each other with shells day and night. The Germans had pre-registered their artillery on every field and road junction, allowing them to bring down accurate fire on any American advance. The Allies responded with their superior numbers of guns, raining steel on German positions. Living under constant artillery fire created its own special kind of stress. A shell could arrive without warning at any moment. The only sound was the distant boom of firing, then the incoming whistle, and finally the explosion, if you lived long enough to hear it. Men developed superstitions and routines they believed kept them safe. Some never bunched up in groups larger than 3. Others carried lucky charms, a rabbit's foot, a girlfriend's scarf, a particular coin. One man in Tommy's platoon never changed his socks, convinced that the one time he had done so, his buddy had been killed by a shell. Sleep became a rare and precious commodity. Even when not actively fighting, the men had to dig foxholes for protection from artillery. These often filled with water, forcing soldiers to sleep sitting up, backs against the muddy walls, feet submerged in cold water. Those lucky enough to find shelter in a barn or damaged building still had to contend with the constant noise of warfare and the pressing need for vigilance. Food was another challenge. Hot meals were rare, usually only available when units were pulled back for brief rests. Most of the time, the men subsisted on K-rations, pre-packaged meals that provided adequate nutrition but little satisfaction. Each came in a waxed cardboard box about the size of a cracker box and contained canned meat, spam, or processed ham, usually crackers, a chocolate or fruit bar, instant coffee, and 4 cigarettes. Designed to be eaten cold, they became even less appealing when soaked by the constant rain. Personal hygiene deteriorated quickly under these conditions. Shaving became sporadic, then rare, then abandoned altogether by many. Baths or showers were almost non-existent. Men went weeks without changing their uniforms, which became stiff with dirt, sweat, and blood. Skin conditions like trench foot became common as feet remained wet inside boots for days on end. "How's your feet?" Sergeant Gaines asked Tommy during a rare, quiet moment as they huddled under a camouflage poncho, sharing a cigarette. "Not great," Tommy admitted, pulling off a waterlogged boot to reveal white, wrinkled skin. "Can't remember the last time they were dry." "Change your socks anyway," Gaines advised. "Even wet, clean ones are better than wet, dirty ones. And rub them when you can. Keep the blood flowing." This kind of knowledge, practical wisdom passed from veterans to newcomers, was often the difference between those who survived and those who didn't. Which routes were safer from sniper fire, how to tell from the sound if an artillery shell was going to land near you, the importance of digging your foxhole deep enough despite exhaustion, how to spot trip wires for booby traps, the hedgerow fighting ground on day after day, week after week. Small objectives took on outsized importance: a crossroads, a farm, a small rise that provided observation over the surrounding fields. Men died by the dozens for patches of ground that would have been meaningless in peacetime. Tommy's world narrowed to the immediate: the next field, the next hedgerow, the next meal, the next chance to sleep. The broader war faded from his consciousness. He vaguely knew that fighting continued on Omaha and the other beaches, that supplies and reinforcements poured in daily, that great plans were being formulated by generals miles from the front. But none of that seemed to matter in the claustrophobic confines of the bocage. Time became fluid, measured not in hours or days, but in operations and pauses. The attack on this farm, the defense of that road junction, the night spent in a partially destroyed church, the afternoon huddled in a water-filled foxhole as German shells fell like rain. Sometimes, in brief moments of clarity between operations, Tommy would look around and be startled by where he was and what he was doing. A farm boy from Ohio crouched in the mud of Normandy, thousands of miles from home, trying to kill men he had never met for reasons that seemed increasingly abstract. In those moments, the absurdity of war would hit him like a physical blow. But such moments never lasted long. The next order would come, the next movement forward, the next burst of adrenaline as bullets cracked overhead, and Tommy would be back in the immediate present, all philosophical thoughts pushed aside by the urgent need to survive. One evening in early July, as Tommy's company took shelter in a small village they had captured that day, mail arrived from home. It was the first delivery in weeks, and men fell upon the letters and packages like starving animals. Tommy received 3 letters, 2 from his mother and 1 from a girl he had dated briefly before the war. He sat on an overturned bucket outside a damaged barn and read by the last light of day. His mother's letters were full of the small details of life in Ohio: who had married whom, how the crops were doing, her work with the local Red Cross chapter. Normal life continuing as if another world of mud and death didn't exist across the ocean. The girl's letter was different, full of questions about when he might come home, what France was like, whether he had met any pretty French girls. The innocence of it made Tommy smile despite his exhaustion. She had no conception of what his life was like now, and he had no intention of telling her. Some things were better left unshared. As darkness fell, Tommy folded the letters carefully and tucked them inside his jacket, close to his heart. Artillery flashed on the horizon, a constant reminder that tomorrow would bring more fighting, more hedgerows, more death. But for tonight, at least, he had this small connection to home, this reminder that somewhere, normal life continued. The next morning brought what the men had been waiting for, a major offensive aimed at finally breaking out of the hedgerow country. Operation Cobra, they called it. The plan was to use carpet bombing by heavy aircraft to blast a gap in the German lines, allowing American armor to pour through and into the open country beyond the bocage. "It's going to be big," Sergeant Gaines told the platoon as they prepared their equipment. "Biggest air show of the war, they say. Hundreds of bombers hitting a narrow front. After that, we go in and mop up whatever's left." The men's spirits lifted at the news. After weeks of slow, grinding combat, the prospect of a breakthrough energized everyone. Tommy found himself checking and rechecking his equipment with renewed focus. Maybe this would be the operation that finally ended the Hedgerow Hell. As dawn broke on July 25th, Tommy and the others waited in their jump-off positions. The sky was clear for once. Perfect conditions for the planned air attack. The men were spread out more than usual. They had been warned that some bombs might fall short, and no one wanted to present a concentrated target. The waiting was the hardest part. Hours passed as the men lay in their foxholes or crouched behind hedgerows. Some dozed. Others wrote letters or cleaned their weapons yet again. The tension built with each passing minute. Then, around mid-morning, they heard it, the distant drone of aircraft engines. Looking up, Tommy saw them. Hundreds of bombers flying in formation, their aluminum skins catching the sunlight. The sight was both beautiful and terrifying. "Here it comes," Sergeant Gaines said unnecessarily. "Keep your heads down and pray those boys up there know what they're doing." The first bombs fell far ahead on the German positions. The earth seemed to shake with each explosion. Huge columns of smoke and dust rose into the air. The sound was unlike anything Tommy had heard before. Not the crack of individual shells, but a continuous rolling thunder that seemed to go on forever. Then disaster struck. Some of the bombers released their payloads too early. Tommy watched in horror as explosions marched toward the American lines. Men scrambled for whatever cover they could find as 2,000-pound bombs crashed down around them. The ground heaved beneath Tommy as he pressed himself into his foxhole. Dirt and debris rained down. The concussion from nearby explosions felt like giant hands squeezing his body. For several terrifying minutes, the world consisted of nothing but noise and pressure and fear. When it finally ended, Tommy cautiously raised his head. The landscape had been transformed. Where there had been hedgerows and fields, there was now a cratered moonscape. Dust hung in the air, making it difficult to see or breathe. "Sound off," Sergeant Gaines shouted, his voice barely audible over the ringing in Tommy's ears. "Who's still with us?" The roll call revealed the cost of the short bombing. 3 men dead, 6 wounded. And they were the lucky ones. Reports filtered in of entire companies wiped out by bombs meant for the enemy. Despite the losses, the order came to advance. The bombing, for all its tragic errors, had shattered the German front line. As Tommy's company moved forward, they encountered dazed German survivors wandering in the devastated landscape. Many surrendered without resistance, too shocked to fight. For the first time since landing in Normandy, they advanced more than a mile in a single day. And the next day brought even more progress as the German lines crumbled. Operation Cobra, despite its costly beginning, was working. The breakout from the hedgerows had begun. As they pushed forward into more open country south of the bocage, Tommy found himself looking back at the hedgerow country with a mixture of relief and lingering dread. For nearly 7 weeks, that landscape of small fields and ancient barriers had been his world, a green maze where death lurked around every corner. He had entered it a frightened replacement fresh from the horror of Omaha Beach. He emerged a veteran, hardened by experiences that would stay with him forever. The Battle of Normandy wasn't over. There would be more fighting before France was liberated, but the worst was behind them. The hedgerows that had cost so many American lives were now just a memory, though one that would haunt the dreams of survivors for decades to come. As the sun set on the newly liberated French countryside, Tommy found a moment to write in the small notebook he carried. His entry was brief, just a few lines about the bombing, the advance, the sense that something had finally broken in the German defenses. But he ended with a thought that summed up the hedgerow experience for thousands of American soldiers. "Made it through the bocage. Never want to see another hedgerow as long as I live." While Tommy and the other Allied soldiers pushed through the hedgerows of Normandy, a very different experience unfolded on the German side of the battle lines. For the defenders, the summer of 1944 became a desperate struggle against overwhelming odds, a fight they were slowly but inevitably losing. Oberfeldwebel, staff sergeant, Karl Muller peered through his field glasses at the American positions from the attic of a half-destroyed farmhouse. At 32, he was considered an old man by the standards of his unit. Most replacements arriving now were either teenagers barely out of the Hitler Youth or middle-aged men previously deemed unfit for frontline service. The core of experienced soldiers who had fought in Russia, Africa, and Italy was dwindling daily. "What do you see?" asked Gefreiter Corporal Weber, a pale boy of maybe 17 who had arrived as a replacement 3 days earlier. "They're bringing up more of those modified tanks," Muller replied, watching Shermans with strange prong-like attachments move into position. Something new, some kind of hedge-cutting device. He'd been in Normandy since 1943 with the 352nd Infantry Division, tasked with coastal defense. They'd spent months building bunkers, laying mines, and installing beach obstacles, the vaunted Atlantic Wall that Hitler had promised would repel any invasion. But when the Allies came on June 6th, the wall had failed. Despite inflicting heavy casualties at Omaha Beach, they couldn't push the Americans back into the sea. What followed was a fighting retreat through the Norman countryside, falling back one hedgerow at a time as Allied pressure became unbearable. "Get some rest," Muller told Weber, handing him the binoculars. "Watch for movement, but don't expose yourself. Their snipers are good." The boy nodded eagerly, still wanting to prove himself. Muller wondered how long that enthusiasm would last once the shelling started again. Downstairs in the farmhouse, Feldwebel, Sergeant Dietmar Schmidt studied a map. "Any change?" "They've got more of those hedge-cutting tanks," Muller reported. "If they can breach anywhere they want." Schmidt frowned. The hedgerows had been their best defensive asset, channeling Americans into predictable killing zones. If the Allies could now punch through it well. "The 88 won't cover enough approaches," Schmidt said, referring to their prized 88mm anti-tank guns. "We'll have to fall back again." The house shuddered as artillery began falling nearby, the Americans' customary pre-attack bombardment. A picture of a pastoral Norman landscape fell from the wall and shattered. "Here they come again," Schmidt said wearily. "Same as yesterday. Same as tomorrow." The men took positions, machine guns covering the fields, riflemen at windows, their lone 88mm gun concealed in the barn. They had mines scattered across likely approaches, tripwires connected to booby traps, pre-registered artillery coordinates. They would make the Americans pay. But Muller harbored no illusions. There were too many Americans, too many tanks, too many planes. The nightly radio reports grew more desperate. Reinforcements promised, but never arriving. Fuel so scarce vehicles were abandoned, ammunition rationed carefully. The artillery intensified. Men pressed against walls or dug into foxholes. Shrapnel tore through the roof. Then Muller heard it, the distinctive rumble of Sherman tank engines. "They're flanking left," Weber called from the attic. "Tanks moving through the orchard." Muller grabbed his MP-40 submachine gun and rushed to a west-facing window. Through a gap in the hedgerow, he saw a Sherman with its new tusked prow tearing through the ancient barrier like paper. Behind it came American infantry moving in practiced bounds. "Schmidt, shift the 88. They're coming through the west hedgerow." Before the anti-tank gun could be repositioned, the world exploded. A shell from another Sherman struck the farmhouse directly. Bricks and mortar erupted. Muller was thrown against a wall, momentarily stunned. When his vision cleared, part of the ceiling had collapsed. Dust filled the air. Someone screamed in pain. "Schmidt! Weber!" Muller croaked, coughing on dust. "Report." Schmidt emerged, blood streaking his face from a forehead cut. "The 88's gone. Direct hit on the barn. Weber and Kraus with it. No time to mourn." American infantry were advancing using the destroyed barn as cover. Muller could hear their M1 Garants, the distinctive ping of ejected clips. "Fall back to the cellar," he ordered. "We'll hold as long as possible, then retreat after dark." The cellar provided better protection. Muller's remaining men, just 5 now, less than half their original strength, set up firing positions at small ground-level windows. They would make their stand. The next hours blurred together, brief, intense firefights as Americans tried to approach, followed by lulls as they pulled back to let tanks or artillery work. The Germans conserved ammunition, taking only sure shots. Every bullet was precious now. By evening, the attacks tapered off. The Americans had secured the barn and outbuildings, but seemed content to wait until morning before assaulting the farmhouse itself. In the relative quiet of dusk, Muller assessed their situation. For men left, critically low ammunition, little food beyond some tins and stale bread. "We pull out at 2200, Muller told the others. "Fall back to the rally point at St. Lo. HQ's organizing a new defensive line there." The men nodded tiredly. They'd done this many times before, abandoning positions under cover of darkness, leaving behind the dead, marching through the night to new lines that would inevitably be attacked tomorrow. At precisely 10 p.m., they slipped out the cellar's exterior door into the kitchen garden. The cloudy night provided cover as they moved silently across fields and through a small stream. For hours they navigated the Norman maze, avoiding roads and open fields where American patrols might spot them. The landscape, so picturesque in peacetime, had become a nightmare of broken trees, shell craters, and hastily dug graves. The stench of death hung everywhere, rotting corpses of men and animals left unburied in the fighting. Around 2 a.m., they encountered a German reconnaissance unit, motorcyclists from the 2nd SS Panzer Division scouting American positions. "You're from the 352nd?" the SS lieutenant asked. When Muller nodded, he delivered grim news. "St. Lo is being evacuated. New defensive line is along the Purrier-St. Lo highway." Another retreat, another admission they couldn't hold. Muller felt the familiar weariness. How long could this continue before something broke? Either the German army's cohesion or the Allied momentum. The SS offered transport, 3 motorcycles with sidecars and a captured American Jeep. A small mercy in this merciless campaign. Muller and his men crowded into the vehicles and set off along country lanes, avoiding main roads where Allied aircraft might spot them. As they rode, Muller sat next to a young SS soldier who couldn't have been more than 18. Despite the SS reputation for fanaticism, the boy looked as exhausted as any Wehrmacht infantryman. "How long have you been in Normandy?" Muller asked. "Since D-Day +1, the boy replied. "We were rushed up from Toulouse when the invasion started." "Any word from the Eastern Front?" The SS soldier shook his head. "Nothing good. The Russians launched a big offensive in June. Army Group Center is collapsing." It was the story of the war now. Retreat on all fronts. The great advances of 1939 to 42 had become a steady contraction as Germany's enemies closed in from east and west. They reached the new defensive line before dawn, a hastily prepared position along a small river. Engineers worked by lamplight to prepare bridge demolitions. Infantry dug foxholes and machine gun nests. A few tanks and self-propelled guns were dug in at key points. A harried captain assigned Muller's group to a section near a stone bridge. "Hold as long as possible," he instructed. "When ordered, fall back across the bridge. Engineers will blow it after." The same story at every position. Hold, delay, withdraw. A fighting retreat that seemed to have no end except eventual defeat. Muller set his men to improving their positions, deepening foxholes, clearing fields of fire, setting tripwires. The work was familiar, almost comforting in its routine. This was what they did now: prepare, fight, retreat, prepare again. At dawn, Muller surveyed their new position. The river valley was peaceful in the early light, mist rising from the water, birds singing in trees. If not for the men in field gray digging in, it might have been a scene from before the war. The peace shattered as American artillery opened up their daily bombardment of suspected German positions. Soon shells were falling along the river line, sending geysers of earth and water into the air. The men hunched in foxholes as fragments rained down. This was the German experience in Normandy, constant retreat under relentless pressure. The glory days of blitzkrieg were gone, replaced by a grinding defensive war against an enemy with overwhelming resources. Throughout the day, they watched American reconnaissance units probe the river line. Occasional firefights broke out, but the main American force hadn't arrived yet. They were being methodical. Why rush when time was on their side? By evening, new orders came. Their unit would be relieved overnight by elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division. They were to move to St. Lo to join the city's defense. The Americans are making St. Lo their main objective, the messenger explained. Every available man is being sent there. Muller nodded, though he wondered how many available men the Wehrmacht could still muster. His own regiment, which had arrived in France over 3,000 strong, was down to barely 600 effectives. The relief came around midnight. Young SS Panzer Grenadiers with better equipment and fresher faces than Muller's weathered infantrymen. A truck took Muller's group to St. Lo, or what remained of it. The once picturesque Norman town had been reduced to rubble by Allied bombing and artillery. Streets were canyons of debris through which German soldiers had cleared paths. The few remaining civilians hid in cellars. Their new position was in a partially collapsed church near the town center, the thick stone walls having withstood bombardment better than modern buildings. The unit they replaced, a mix of Wehrmacht infantry and Luftwaffe ground crew pressed into service as infantry, looked even more exhausted than Muller's men. Americans are all around the city, their departing commander reported. They control the high ground north and east. Artillery hits constantly. Watch for snipers. They've infiltrated the ruins. Muller organized his depleted squad, now reinforced with a few replacements, into a defensive perimeter within the church ruins. They had good fields of fire down the main street, and the thick walls provided better protection than open fields or farmhouses. Among the replacements was an older man named Kramer, maybe in his 40s, a Hamburg policeman before being drafted. He handled his rifle competently, but lacked combat experience. Is it always this bad? Kramer asked as American artillery pounded the city. Muller almost laughed. This is nothing. You should have seen Omaha Beach on D-Day, or the first weeks in the hedgerows. Kramer looked unconvinced. The constant artillery was terrifying to newcomers who hadn't yet learned to distinguish between shells that would land nearby versus those merely passing overhead. You'll learn the difference, Muller assured him. The dangerous ones sound different. It was knowledge that could only be gained through experience. The subtle variations in sound that told a veteran soldier whether to hit the dirt or keep moving. Like so much of war, it couldn't be taught in training camps. The night passed relatively quietly. Just sporadic artillery and occasional small arms fire as patrols clashed in the ruins. Muller managed a few hours of the shallow, alert sleep combat soldiers mastered, ready to wake fully in seconds if needed. Dawn brought renewed American pressure. A systematic artillery bombardment walking shells through the ruined streets with methodical precision. After the artillery came tanks and infantry probing German defenses. From his position in the church tower, one of the few high points still standing, Muller saw American infantry working through eastern ruins. They moved carefully, covering each other, using debris for concealment. These weren't the green troops of D-Day, but veterans who had learned urban combat's hard lessons. Hold fire until they're within 200 meters, Muller instructed. Make every shot count. Ammunition was critically short, another constant problem. While Americans fired almost at will, Germans had to conserve every bullet. On the morning of July 25, 1944, the sky over Normandy filled with aircraft. Not the fighter bombers that had been a constant presence since D-Day, but something far more terrifying. Waves of heavy bombers. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators. Their aluminum skins glinting in the sunlight as they approached in perfect formation. Nearly 1,500 of them, escorted by 500 fighters, all headed for a narrow stretch of the front line west of St. Lo. Lieutenant David Wilson, a 24-year-old tank commander with the 2nd Armored Division, watched from his position just behind American lines as the aerial armada passed overhead. After 7 weeks of grinding combat in the hedgerows, something big was finally happening. Operation Cobra, the breakout they'd all been whispering about for days. Never seen anything like it, said Sergeant Pete Martinez, Wilson's gunner, as he stared up at the bomber stream. You think this'll work, Lieutenant? Wilson shrugged. If this doesn't break them, nothing will. Their Sherman tank, nicknamed Betty Lou after Martinez's fiancée back in Texas, was one of hundreds positioned to exploit the gap the bombers were supposed to create. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Use heavy bombers, normally reserved for strategic targets deep behind enemy lines, to carpet bomb a narrow section of the German front. Once the defenders were stunned or obliterated, American armor and infantry would pour through the breach into the open country beyond the hedgerows. The bombing began at 9:38 a.m. From Wilson's position, it looked like the horizon itself was erupting. Waves of explosions walked across the German lines, throwing earth, trees, and bodies into the air. The ground shook as if from an earthquake. The sound was a continuous rolling thunder that seemed to come from everywhere at once. For nearly an hour, the bombers pounded a rectangular area about 3 miles wide and 1 mile deep. More than 4,000 tons of explosives fell in that small zone. When the last bomber turned back toward England, a pall of smoke and dust hung over the target area, visible for miles. "Mount up," came the order over the radio. "All units prepare to advance." Wilson and his crew climbed into Betty Lou. Wilson in the commander's cupola, Martinez on the gun, Corporal Jenkins driving, and Privates Doyle and Washington loading and operating the radio. They were a veteran crew now, having fought together since D-Day. Their original Sherman had been knocked out during the Hedgerow fighting, but they'd all survived to be assigned this replacement. The tank's engine roared to life, adding to the growing rumble as hundreds of vehicles prepared to move. Artillery opened up, targeting areas beyond the bomb zone where German reserves might be organizing. All elements of combat command, advance. Betty Lou lurched forward, joining a column of tanks moving toward what had been the German front line. The landscape they entered was apocalyptic, a moonscape of overlapping craters where nothing remained standing. The hedgerows that had defined the battlefield for weeks had been obliterated. Trees were reduced to splintered stumps. The rich Norman soil had been turned inside out, exposing pale clay that looked like bleached bone in the summer sun. And there were bodies, or parts of bodies, everywhere. German soldiers caught in the open had simply ceased to exist as coherent human beings. What remained was scattered across the churned earth like gruesome confetti. "Jesus," Martinez whispered over the intercom. "There's nothing left." He was wrong. As the American advance reached the far edge of the bombed zone, resistance appeared. Not the coordinated defense they'd faced in the hedgerows, but desperate clusters of survivors trying to form some semblance of a defensive line. Machine guns fired from shell craters. A Panzer IV tank, somehow intact despite the bombing, engaged 3 Shermans before being knocked out. Snipers took shots from the ruins of a small hamlet. But there was no stopping the American breakthrough now. The German line had been shattered both physically and psychologically. Many survivors were in shock, unable to mount effective resistance. Others surrendered in groups, emerging from bunkers and cellars with vacant expressions and trembling hands. By nightfall, Wilson's unit had advanced nearly 7 miles, more than they'd gained in the previous month of hedgerow fighting. And they weren't alone. All along the breakthrough sector, American armored columns were pushing into open country beyond the bocage. Operation Cobra was succeeding beyond the most optimistic projections. The next day brought even more dramatic progress. With German defenses in disarray, American armor and mechanized infantry raced south and east. Wilson's tank battalion covered nearly 20 miles, encountering only scattered resistance. The grinding attrition of the Hedgerow battle had been replaced by a war of movement, the kind of mobile warfare American forces had trained for but been unable to execute in the confined Norman landscape. For the tankers, it was exhilarating. After weeks of crawling forward a few hundred yards at a time, Betty Lou and the other Shermans roared down country roads and across open fields, their crews scanning for threats, but finding few. Occasionally, a German anti-tank gun would fire from concealment, or a panzer team would attempt an ambush, but these were isolated incidents rather than the coordinated defense they'd faced before. "This is more like it," Martinez said as they paused to refuel late on the second day. "If we'd been doing this since D-Day, we'd be in Paris by now." Wilson nodded, though he knew it wasn't that simple. The breakout had been possible only because of the weeks of grinding combat that had worn down German reserves and pulled their best units into the Hedgerow battle. Operation Cobra had succeeded because the enemy no longer had the strength to resist across the entire front. On the third day, they reached Avranches, a small city at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula. Its capture marked a strategic turning point. From Avranches, American forces could turn west into Brittany or east toward the Seine River and Paris. With the German line broken, both options were now open. General Patton's newly activated Third Army took over the exploitation of the breakthrough. His forces turned east, threatening to encircle all German forces still fighting in Normandy. Meanwhile, the British and Canadians launched their own offensive east of Caen, putting additional pressure on the already strained German defenses. For Wilson and his tank crew, the dramatic change in the nature of the war was both welcome and disorienting. After weeks where progress was measured in yards and every hedgerow might hide an anti-tank gun, they were now advancing dozens of miles each day, often without firing a shot. The war had suddenly accelerated, creating a sense that the end might be in sight. But if the Americans were experiencing a heady rush of success, the German forces in Normandy were descending into a nightmare. With American armor driving east from Avranches and British forces pushing south from Caen, they faced the prospect of encirclement. Hitler, refusing to authorize a general withdrawal, ordered a counterattack at Mortain aimed at cutting off Patton's advancing spearheads. The attack, launched on August 7th, failed disastrously. With complete air superiority, Allied aircraft caught the German armored columns in the open and devastated them. The last German reserves had been committed and defeated. Now the trap began to close. By mid-August, American forces had reached Argentan from the south while British and Canadian units approached Falaise from the north. Between them were elements of two German armies, nearly 100,000 men at risk of being completely surrounded. The area that would become known as the Falaise Pocket was roughly triangular, bounded by Argentan, Falaise, and the town of Chambois. As Allied forces tightened the noose, the German units inside faced a desperate choice: surrender or attempt to escape through the narrowing gap in the Allied lines. Most chose to try for escape, creating one of the most chaotic and devastating battle scenes of the war. Tens of thousands of German soldiers, along with their vehicles, artillery, and the remnants of their panzer units, converged on the last possible exit route. Allied aircraft circled overhead like vultures, striking at anything that moved. Artillery pounded the pocket day and night. On the ground, American, British, Canadian, and Polish forces fought to close the final gap near Chambois. Inside the pocket, the situation deteriorated hourly. Food and medical supplies ran out. Ammunition became scarce. Vehicles desperate for fuel were abandoned by the hundreds. The wounded lay in makeshift aid stations with little or no treatment. The dead went unburied, their bodies adding to the growing stench that hung over the battlefield. On August 19th, Wilson's tank battalion was part of the force assigned to close the last gap in the Allied lines near Chambois. As they approached the town, they encountered the full horror of what was happening inside the pocket. The roads leading east were choked with destroyed and abandoned German vehicles. Tanks, half-tracks, trucks, horse-drawn wagons, staff cars, all jumbled together in a grotesque traffic jam. Between and beneath the vehicles lay bodies, hundreds of them, some intact, others torn apart by artillery or air attacks. Wounded men cried out for help that wouldn't come. Loose horses, their handlers dead, wandered aimlessly among the carnage. "My God," Jenkins whispered as they surveyed the scene from a ridge overlooking one of the escape routes. "It's like the end of the world down there." Wilson had never seen anything like it, not even on Omaha Beach. This wasn't combat as he'd experienced it before, two sides fighting for tactical advantage. This was slaughter, pure and simple. The Germans trapped in the pocket had nowhere to go, no way to fight back effectively. They were simply being annihilated. The final gap was closed on August 21st, though thousands of German soldiers had managed to escape before the pocket was completely sealed. Those who remained, estimated between 50,000 and 60,000, were killed or captured. Allied soldiers who entered the pocket after its reduction would never forget what they found. One American officer described it as a battlefield that surpassed even Hollywood's wildest imagination. Bodies were piled so thickly in some areas that vehicles couldn't pass without driving over them. The wreckage of over 10,000 vehicles littered the landscape. The stench was so overwhelming that hardened combat veterans became physically ill. For Wilson and his crew, the closing of the Falaise Pocket marked the effective end of the Battle of Normandy. Though pockets of German resistance remained in some coastal fortresses, the organized defense had collapsed. The road to Paris lay open, with Patton's forces already approaching the outskirts of the French capital. "Think we'll get to Paris?" Martinez asked as they performed maintenance on Betty Lou the day after the pocket was closed. "Doubt it," Wilson replied. "Word is we're heading for Belgium and the German border. Let the Free French have the glory of liberating Paris." He was right. The strategic objective now wasn't the French capital, but Germany itself. Allied forces were already planning the next phase of the campaign, the drive to the Rhine and into the German heartland. But first, there was a brief period of rest and reflection. Wilson's battalion pulled back to an assembly area near Argenton, where replacements, supplies, and fresh equipment arrived daily. The physical toll of nearly 3 months of continuous combat was evident in the men's gaunt faces and exhausted eyes. The mental toll was harder to see, but no less real. Wilson found himself unable to sleep for more than an hour or two at a time, jolting awake at the slightest sound. Martinez had developed a persistent twitch in his right eye. Jenkins, normally talkative, had grown silent and withdrawn. They were experiencing what the doctors called combat fatigue, but what the men themselves recognized simply as the accumulated strain of too many days under fire, too many friends lost, too much death witnessed and dealt. On a warm evening in late August, Wilson sat on Betty Lou's turret writing a letter to his parents in Pennsylvania. How could he describe what he'd experienced since landing in Normandy? What words could possibly convey the terror of Omaha Beach, the claustrophobic dread of the hedgerows, the mechanical slaughter of the Falaise Pocket? In the end, he wrote about the French countryside, the historic towns they'd passed through, the occasional kindness of civilians who offered food or wine to their liberators. He wrote about his crew, their health and spirits. He wrote about the weather, the food, trivial things that would reassure without revealing. The true Normandy, the one of mud and blood and death, he kept to himself. Perhaps someday he could speak of it, but not yet, not in a letter home. Around him, the vast Allied war machine was preparing for the next phase of the campaign. Fresh divisions arrived daily from England. Trucks shuttled constantly between the beaches and the front, bringing forward the mountains of supplies needed to sustain the advance into Germany. Engineers rebuilt bridges, cleared roads, and constructed airfields in fields that had been battlegrounds just days before. The statistical summary of the Battle of Normandy was staggering. In just over 2 months of fighting, the Allies had suffered more than 209,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing, or captured. The Germans had lost even more, around 200,000 casualties plus another 200,000 taken prisoner. Nearly 20,000 French civilians had died, many in the Allied bombing that had preceded the invasion or destroyed towns during the campaign. But statistics couldn't capture the human reality of what had happened in Normandy. Each number represented a life ended or forever altered. A family that would receive a telegram bringing news of death or wounding. A young man who would return home changed in ways that those who hadn't experienced combat could never fully understand. For Wilson, the Battle of Normandy had been a transformative experience. From the horror of Omaha Beach to the triumphant breakout of Operation Cobra and the apocalyptic scenes of the Falaise Pocket, he had entered France as a newly commissioned lieutenant with textbook knowledge of armored warfare. He emerged as a combat veteran who had seen the best and worst that humans could be, who had learned lessons about leadership and survival that no training could provide. As the sun set over the Norman countryside, Wilson finished his letter and sealed it in an envelope. Tomorrow would bring new orders, a new phase of the campaign, new challenges and dangers. Germany was still far from defeated, and hard fighting lay ahead on the road to Berlin. But tonight, in this peaceful corner of Normandy, Wilson allowed himself to believe that the worst was behind them. The Atlantic Wall had been breached, the Hedgerow country conquered, the German armies in France shattered. The great gamble of D-Day had paid off, though at a terrible cost. In the soft evening light, the battlefield had begun to return to its former self. Farmers ventured into fields where the fighting had passed, assessing damage and beginning the long process of rebuilding. Children played in village squares that had been combat zones just weeks before. The resilience of the Norman people, like the land itself, was already asserting itself against the ravages of war. Wilson slipped down from the tank turret and walked to the nearby field where the battalion's mail was being collected. As he handed over his letter, he glanced back at Betty Lou, scarred by combat, but still functional, still carrying him and his crew forward toward whatever waited ahead. Like the tank, he had been damaged but not broken by Normandy. He would carry its lessons and memories with him for the rest of his life. The Battle of Normandy had changed the course of the war, opening the Western Front that would eventually lead to Germany's defeat. It had also changed the men who fought in it, marking them in visible and invisible ways. Some of those marks would fade with time. Others would remain forever, like the thousands of white crosses that now dotted the Norman coastline where American cemeteries had been established. As night fell, Wilson returned to his crew and the familiar routine of maintenance checks in preparation for whatever the next day might bring. The great drama of Normandy was ending, passing into history even as those who had lived through it struggled to comprehend its full meaning. Elsewhere in Normandy, Tommy Miller, the young infantryman who had survived Omaha Beach and the Hedgerow Hell, was also reflecting on the campaign as his unit prepared to move toward the German border. In a half-destroyed barn serving as temporary shelter, he wrote in the journal he'd carried since D-Day, "It's over, at least this part. We're leaving Normandy tomorrow. Hard to believe we've been in France less than 3 months. Feels like years. So many gone. Jackson, Martinez, Liberowitz, the lieutenant, Sarge from Baker Company, the replacement whose name I never learned. Too many to list. They say we're heading east, all the way to Germany. I just want to get it over with and go home. But first, we finish what we started on Omaha." For James Cooper, the paratrooper who had dropped into darkness on the night before D-Day, Normandy had been a crucible that tested everything he thought he knew about himself and his fellow soldiers. Now, as his unit regrouped and integrated replacements for their heavy losses, he found himself acting as mentor to fresh-faced kids who hadn't experienced the desperate early days of the invasion. "Keep your head down, your weapon clean, and listen to the veterans," he advised a group of replacements who had arrived that morning. "Normandy was bad, but at least we knew the Germans couldn't get behind us because of the channel. From here on, we'll be surrounded by enemy territory. Stay alert." And for Karl Muller, the German sergeant who had fought a losing battle from D-Day through the collapse of the Falaise Pocket, Normandy had been the beginning of the end. He had escaped the pocket with a small group of his men, making their way east under cover of darkness, avoiding Allied patrols. Now they were part of the hasty defensive line being established along the Seine River, another temporary barrier that would inevitably be overcome. "We cannot win this war," he told Schmidt as they dug foxholes overlooking a crossing point on the Seine. "After what I saw in the pocket, there is no hope of victory now." Schmidt merely nodded. Words were unnecessary between men who had survived the crucible of Normandy. They would continue to fight, not for Hitler or Germany's conquests, but for each other and the slim hope of personal survival in a war that was clearly lost. Across Normandy, as August gave way to September, the physical evidence of battle began to fade. Farmers returned to their fields, working around bomb craters and disabled vehicles. Villages started to rebuild, clearing rubble and repairing damaged buildings. The dead, American, British, Canadian, German, French, were buried in hastily established cemeteries that would later become permanent memorials. But the impact of those 85 days of combat would echo through history. The Battle of Normandy had been the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. the successful establishment of the long-awaited Second Front that would eventually meet the Soviet advance from the east. More immediately, it had liberated much of France and positioned Allied forces to drive into the German homeland. For the men who fought there, Normandy would remain a defining experience, a time when ordinary humans were called upon to endure and accomplish extraordinary things. Farm boys from Kansas, factory workers from Michigan, clerks from New York, and their counterparts from Britain, Canada, and other Allied nations had faced the best that Germany could muster and prevailed, though at a terrible cost. They had come ashore on beaches codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. They had fought through the deadly maze of the bocage. They had liberated ancient Norman towns and villages. They had closed the Falaise Pocket and shattered German military power in France. And now they would carry the war eastward, following the path they had opened on D-Day to its ultimate conclusion in the heart of the Third Reich. The sun set one final time on the Normandy battlefield, casting long shadows across ground that had been contested foot by bloody foot throughout the summer of 1944. In field hospitals, the wounded dreamed of home. In temporary camps, the exhausted slept the deep sleep of physical and emotional depletion. In newly dug graves, the dead kept their eternal silence. The Battle of Normandy was over. The war moved on eastward toward Germany, leaving behind a transformed landscape and countless lives forever changed by what had happened on this small piece of French coastline and countryside. Years later, visitors would come to walk the beaches and hedgerows where so many had fought and died. They would stand in the American cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach with its endless rows of white crosses and stars of David. They would visit the museums and memorials that attempted to convey something of what had happened there. But only those who had lived through those 85 days in the summer of 1944 could truly know what it had been like to fight in the Battle of Normandy. As you rest now, perhaps you can imagine the quiet that finally settled over those Norman fields when the guns fell silent and the tanks rolled eastward. The gentle rustle of wind through apple orchards that had been battlegrounds. The slow return of birds to hedgerows that had concealed machine guns. The gradual healing of a land that had seen too much death, but would in time become green and peaceful once more. And with that, close your eyes and drift off to sleep.